My parents left me with strangers at 10 so they could travel the world. Here's how I vanished from their lives forever and built a future they'll never know. It all began with a worn-out duffel bag sitting quietly by the front door, its zipper pulled tight like a secret I wasn't meant to question. I was only 10 at the time, still young enough to believe that parents always told the truth, but old enough to sense when something wasn't right. That afternoon, I come home from school expecting the usual. My mom in the kitchen pretending to tidy up. My dad buried in a newspaper, but instead, the house felt hollow, like someone had already said goodbye. Martin and Judy sat me down in the living room without looking me in the eyes, and in voices that were too cheerful to be real, they explained that I'd be staying with some good friends for a little while. They didn't bother with details, no explanation beyond a vague mention of a work opportunity overseas, and they certainly didn't give me a timeline. The whole thing felt rehearsed, like they'd been practicing the speech and just wanted to get it over with. Before I had time to ask anything, we were in the car, pulling out of our driveway in Cleveland and heading toward the edge of town, where the streets turned quieter and the houses looked forgotten. The place we stopped at wasn't unfamiliar. I recognized the house from the handful of times we'd seen Ron and Claire at church events, always waving politely across the pews or making small talk at potlucks. Their house looked smaller than I remembered, the kind of place where the curtains stay drawn and the front porch light flickers like it's too tired to shine. When we pulled into their cracked driveway, the air inside the car grew heavy, like all three of us were holding our breath, but no one wanted to be the first to exhale. My parents didn't linger, didn't offer to help me bring my bag inside, didn't even get out of the car. Judy gave me a quick kiss on the top of my head, the kind you give a neighbor's kid you barely know, and Martin clapped me lightly on the shoulder before telling me to be good. Then they were gone, the taillights fading into the distance while I stood on the porch clutching my bag, watching them disappear without once looking back. Inside, the house felt as cramped as it looked from the outside, with walls that seemed to lean inward and carpets that smelled faintly of old soup and forgotten chores. Ron and Claire had 3 kids of their own, 2 boys and a girl, none of whom seemed the least bit interested in me as I was shown to a tiny room where I'd be sharing a bunk bed with their daughter, Jenna. She didn't say much, just nodded toward the top bunk as if to tell me that was mine now, and then went back to whatever she was doing before I arrived. From the first night, it was obvious that I wasn't meant to be part of their family's rhythm. I wasn't added to their chore chart that hung crookedly on the fridge, and no one asked if I wanted to join in their dinner conversations, not that there was much of one to join. I learned quickly to take up as little space as possible, slipping into the background like an extra in a play where no one even noticed I'd walked on stage. The meals were whatever was left after everyone else had finished, and the food never tasted like home, not that I dared say anything, especially not about the mayonnaise I hated or the fact that the milk always tasted like the fridge. My parents' calls started out as weekly check-ins, brief and awkward on Sunday evenings, where they'd ask if I was behaving and then rush off the line with promises to call soon. Soon turned into later, and later became never. Eventually, the phone just stopped ringing altogether, but I kept it charged beside my pillow every night anyway, just in case they changed their minds. And every morning, when it stayed silent, I reminded myself not to expect anything different. The house, the room, the family, they weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. I was just another chore they hadn't planned for, another mouth to feed when the cupboards already felt too empty. No one asked how I was doing or if I missed home, and I stopped wondering what it would feel like if they did. I had become invisible, and somehow that felt easier than hoping someone might notice me. In the beginning, I kept thinking the phone would eventually ring again, that one day Martin and Judy would remember I existed and ask how I was doing. Every Sunday, I sat near the window with the old cordless phone resting on the sill, waiting for the shrill sound that meant someone still cared. At first, they called like they said they would, voices distant but cheerful, always asking if I was behaving myself and if the Morrisons were treating me well. They never asked if I was happy or lonely or scared, just whether I was following the rules and staying out of trouble. Their voices always sounded rushed, like they had better places to be or people waiting on the other line. After a month or two, those calls started coming less often, slipping from once a week to maybe once a month if I was lucky. After a while, I stopped keeping track of how long it had been, because the answer was always too long. At school, the teachers started noticing that no one came to conferences, no one signed my permission slips, and no one showed up for awards ceremonies or concerts. When they asked about it, I told them that my parents were working overseas, that they were hard to reach, and that everything was fine. It was easier to lie than admit I didn't know where they were or if they'd ever come back. Nobody looked too closely at the story, and I became good at fading into the background. I forged their signatures on forms and wrote my own notes when I needed to. The Morrisons didn't check my homework or ask how I was doing in class, so no one noticed how I started managing everything on my own. The call stopped altogether after a few months, but I still left the phone charged beside my bed each night, full battery, just in case. Even though part of me knew they weren't going to call, I couldn't quite bring myself to give up entirely. Then one afternoon, I was using the Morrisons' ancient desktop computer to print out a science report when I accidentally saw something that made my heart sink in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Claire had left her email open, and there it was, an email from Judy, my mother, thanking her for managing Casey longer than expected and mentioning that they were figuring out the next leg of their trip. The subject line was something about a travel itinerary for Spain and Turkey. I reread it 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood, but the words didn't change. They weren't working abroad like they'd said. They were on vacation, city hopping through Europe and Asia, sending postcards to their friends while I sat in that cramped bedroom waiting for a phone that never rang. After that, I stopped waiting for updates. I started getting myself up in the mornings, made toast or cereal, packed whatever I could find for lunch, and walked to school without a word from anyone. If there wasn't bread, I skipped breakfast, and if there wasn't anything for a sandwich, I filled my lunch bag with crackers or a bruised apple. I learned to do my own laundry, folding clothes I barely recognized anymore, because nothing I wore ever really felt like mine. The Morrisons weren't cruel or neglectful, not in the way people think of when they hear that word. They just had their own lives, their own routines, and I wasn't part of them. I was a guest who'd overstayed, someone they didn't quite know how to include, so they didn't try. When I turned 11, the day passed like any other. No cake or candles, just Claire handing me a keychain she'd picked up at the drugstore and saying, "Sorry things have been hectic lately." I thanked her and tucked it into my pencil case, where it stayed buried at the bottom of a zipper pocket I never opened. There wasn't any celebration, and I didn't expect one, not after all that time. I didn't even tell the kids at school it was my birthday, because what was the point? A few weeks later, I was at the library during recess, using a friend's tablet, when she clicked on a Facebook post from someone I barely remembered, a woman from our old church. The photo showed Martin and Judy sitting at an outdoor cafe in Barcelona, sunglasses on, grinning like they hadn't a care in the world. Another photo popped up of them on a boat somewhere in Greece. And then one with elephants in Chiang Mai. They looked sun-kissed and happy, completely at ease, as if the child they'd left behind was just another thing they'd packed away in a closet before boarding the plane. In the comments, someone asked where I was, and Judy had replied that I was with good friends from church, that it had been a healthy break for all of us. I stared at that comment for what felt like forever, reading it over and over until the words blurred together. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that they thought of it as a break or the fact that they seemed to think it was good for me. After that, I stopped waiting entirely. I stopped checking the phone. I stopped hoping. I started thinking ahead, making plans in my head for a future where they never came back, because that seemed like the only future that made sense anymore. I still went through the motions every day, school, chores, keeping out of everyone's way. But inside, I was already packing up, already figuring out how to build a life where I didn't have to feel forgotten ever again. I stopped asking for anything, because I knew the answer before the words even left my mouth. I became invisible in the way that made everything quieter, easier, simpler. I was the extra piece in a puzzle no one was trying to finish, and after a while, I stopped caring where I fit. By the time I turned 13, I had stopped hoping for anything at all from Martin and Judy, because it was clear they weren't coming back, at least not for me. I kept my head down at school, did my homework at the kitchen table while the Morrisons watched television, and taught myself not to want anything beyond what I could earn or find. I started babysitting for neighbors, walking dogs for people who worked late, and picking up any small job that would pay me a few dollars, because I knew I'd need money to get out of that house eventually. I hid the cash under a loose floorboard in the corner of the room, a place no one ever cleaned or noticed, and I counted it every few weeks, watching the small pile of bills grow slow and steady like a secret I carried everywhere. When I turned 15, I found a job bussing tables at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and frying oil, but felt like freedom every time I walked through the door. I took every shift I could get, working after school and on weekends, pretending I was saving for college or a car when people asked why a kid my age worked so much. In reality, I was saving for an exit, for a chance to finally leave behind the house that never felt like mine and the people who treated me like a guest they couldn't remember inviting. I stopped going to school dances, skipped parties, and said no whenever anyone suggested hanging out after school, because I knew none of that would help me leave. I took extra classes, begged for independent study projects, and stayed late to finish assignments so I could graduate early. The guidance counselor called me driven, told me how impressed she was, and said I was setting myself up for success. But she didn't know I was just desperate to be anywhere else. I applied to colleges as far from that town as possible, looking for places that felt like they existed on another planet, not just in another state. I filled out every scholarship form I could find, pieced together applications during my lunch breaks, and stayed after school to use the library computers when the old one at the Morrisons' house broke down for good. I didn't ask Martin or Judy for anything, not tax forms, not signatures, not help with essays, because I didn't want to owe them anything, not even that. I kept my plans to myself, because I knew if I said them out loud, they'd start to feel fragile, like speaking them might break them apart. When I got the acceptance letter from a school in Minnesota, almost 900 miles away, I waited until the last possible week before mentioning it to anyone. I handed the envelope across the table at dinner, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the sound of my own voice. Judy glanced at it, barely reading the name before saying it sounded pretty far, and Martin just grinned like it was all some joke and said they must have raised me too well. There was no family meeting, no discussion about how I'd get there or what I'd need, just a few vague comments about flights and how exciting it must be. They didn't offer to visit the campus, didn't ask about dorms or classes, didn't even ask when I was leaving. I think they believed I'd change my mind or that I'd never actually go, because they'd spent so long pretending I wasn't planning anything at all. When the day came, I packed my thrift store clothes, secondhand textbooks, and a folder of printed documents into a battered suitcase I'd found at a yard sale. I had just over $1,000 saved, stuffed into a zippered pouch I kept hidden in my backpack, and I'd signed up for a prepaid phone plan under my own name so no one could turn it off or take it away. They drove me to the bus station, hugged me like we were neighbors saying goodbye after a backyard barbecue, and told me to call when I arrived. I nodded, thanked them, and walked toward the bus without looking back. I blocked their numbers before the bus left the station, not because I was angry, but because I didn't want any last-minute calls or messages to pull me back into a life I'd fought so hard to leave. On the ride north, I stared out the window at endless miles of empty fields and small towns, listening to the hum of the engine and feeling nothing at all, no fear, no excitement, no regret. When I got off the bus in the cold morning air of St. Paul, I grabbed my suitcase, hailed a cab to the dorms, and introduced myself to my roommate like I'd always lived alone. No one asked who dropped me off. No one cared why I was there. And that felt like the first real kindness I'd known in years. I opened a checking account during my first week, got a job at the campus dining hall, and made a schedule that I taped to the wall above my desk so I'd always know what came next. I didn't leave a forwarding address, didn't call home, and didn't send any postcards, because there was nothing left to say. I wasn't angry, wasn't sad, wasn't even relieved. I was just done. Life in St. Paul became the kind of quiet I had been chasing for years, a steady rhythm that belonged only to me, without anyone watching or waiting or demanding anything I didn't want to give. I worked late shifts at a gas station a few blocks from my dorm, cleaning sticky floors and restocking shelves while the city slept, and I didn't mind the hours because they kept me too tired to think too much. I learned to budget every dollar I earned, splitting my pay between rent, groceries, and whatever secondhand supplies I needed for class, always making sure there was enough left over for emergencies. I bought my first winter coat at a clearance sale that fall, a thick, ugly thing that didn't match anything I owned, but kept me warm when the winds off the river cut through the city like knives. No one from home ever called because they didn't know the number, and I never gave them a reason to ask. Judy sent a Christmas card that first year, a generic photo of her and Martin in front of a decorated tree, their names scrawled in red ink at the bottom like I was supposed to feel something when I saw it. I didn't keep it, just tossed it in the trash with the takeout containers from the meal I ate alone that night, watching snow fall outside my window. When people on campus asked about my family, I kept my answers short, said they lived far away and we didn't talk much, and they never pushed for more. It was easier that way, easier to let them think I was just busy or focused or private, easier than trying to explain what it felt like to be forgotten on purpose. I stayed on campus during holidays, taking extra shifts at work while everyone else went home, and I didn't mind because at least it meant I didn't have to pretend. Thanksgiving that first year meant boxed macaroni and a soda from the corner store, eaten in front of an old black and white movie I found on public television. Christmas meant helping a friend decorate her tiny apartment with dollar store tinsel and paper snowflakes, drinking cheap wine and laughing about nothing. There were no phone calls, no invitations, no last-minute apologies or offers to send money for a bus ticket. And that silence felt cleaner than any forced reunion ever could. When I turned 19, I landed an internship in Chicago through a professor's connection, packed my few belongings into 2 suitcases, and moved into a Craigslist sublet without telling anyone except my landlord and my work supervisor. The apartment was small and drafty, but it was mine, with a mattress on the floor, mismatched dishes from a thrift store, and blackout curtains that kept out the city lights at night. I didn't send my new address to anyone back home, didn't post about the move, and didn't answer the email Judy sent with the subject line, "Hey stranger," because I didn't want the thread to start again. I started using my grandmother's maiden name on resumes and applications, not legally, just in print, because it felt easier, cleaner, like shedding the last piece of baggage I hadn't meant to carry this far. When the internship ended, I signed a lease on a one-room apartment across town, kept working whatever jobs I could find, and adopted a skittish gray cat from the shelter because she looked like she understood what it meant to want to be left alone. I named her Wren, and at night she curled up beside my old textbooks while I read or filled out applications for jobs that might lead to something steadier. My 21st birthday passed with a homemade cake, a single candle I lit just to blow out, and a glass of discount wine I bought with my tip money from the diner. There were no phone calls, no texts, no cards in the mail, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had made it this far without them. Every so often, a cousin I barely remembered would send a message on social media, asking why I never came to family events or why I stopped answering calls, and I'd ignore it because I didn't owe them explanations. The year I turned 22, I graduated with honors, my name printed in the ceremony program, and my photo hung on a wall in the department building where no one from my family would ever see it. My roommate's parents sent me a card, my manager from the diner left flowers in the break room, and I walked across the stage without thinking about who wasn't there. Afterward, I found a therapist who worked on a sliding scale, someone I paid out of pocket to help me untangle what it meant to grow up in a house with people who stopped seeing me before I was old enough to understand why. I didn't go to talk about Martin or Judy, not really, just to learn how to stop expecting anything from them at all. That summer, I bought a small fireproof safe and tucked every letter, card, and scrap of memory I didn't want into it, not because I planned to revisit them, but because I wanted them contained, sealed away where they couldn't catch me off guard. I didn't block their numbers, didn't tell anyone I'd cut them off, because it wasn't about making a point or proving anything. It was about living without waiting for a call that would never come. By the time I turned 24, I didn't even think of myself as estranged anymore, because that word made it sound like something had happened to me, when really all I'd done was quietly step away. I had built a life that fit me like a well-worn jacket, comfortable and familiar, free from the weight of forced connections or hollow conversations that left me emptier than silence ever could. I lived in a small but steady apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago, worked full-time at an office that valued showing up and finishing work without drama, and filled my evenings with books, music, and the kind of peace I used to think only belonged to other people. For years, I heard nothing from Martin or Judy beyond the occasional email I never opened or a holiday card I tossed into the safe with the rest of the forgotten paper trail. I had no interest in what they were doing, where they lived, or who they pretended to be to people who didn't know better. Then, just after my 30th birthday, the first crack in the quiet appeared, unexpected and unwelcome, when I came home to find a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize wedged under my door. The envelope was plain, the address typed, and there was no return name I could match to anyone in my life. Inside was a single sheet of paper, brief and formal, asking me to contact them regarding a family matter and listing a case number I didn't recognize. I let the letter sit on my counter for days, unread beyond the first line, because I didn't want to invite whatever storm was waiting at the other end of that phone number. But curiosity can wear you down, and after a week of glancing at it every morning, I finally called, using a fake name and a prepaid phone I kept for junk calls, because even after all these years, I didn't want them to have a way back in. The receptionist who answered sounded tired and distracted, flipping through files while she spoke, and she mentioned something about power of attorney and emergency medical decisions before asking if I was calling on behalf of a relative. I hung up without answering, heart racing not because I cared about what was happening to them, but because I hated that after all this time, they could still force their way into my peace. The next day, an email arrived from a name I didn't know, with no subject line and just a single sentence in the body of the message. It said my father had suffered a major heart attack and they were trying to contact family. I moved the email to a folder I never checked, unread beyond that first line, because there was nothing to say that hadn't been said already in 1,000 silences between us. A week later, another letter arrived, this one handwritten and smeared like someone had written it in a rush. It was from my aunt, the only relative who ever tried to play peacemaker, begging me to come home just once because Martin had been asking for me, and she was afraid he didn't have much time left. I folded the letter, slipped it into the safe with the others, and went about my day, because I had learned a long time ago that guilt only works when you let it. When no response came, the call stopped, the email slowed, and the quiet returned. Until one day, I overheard a coworker mentioning a social media post from someone in my extended family celebrating Martin's recovery and how he was reconnecting with everyone. Everyone except me. Months passed without incident, and I let myself believe the storm had finally ended, that whatever unfinished business they thought they had with me had been forgotten in the comfort of being surrounded by people who were willing to overlook the gaps in their stories. Then, without warning, another letter appeared, this time from a retirement facility across the city, addressed not to me by name but to an outdated listing they must have found on some form I'd filled out years ago. Inside was a brochure, a contact form, and a page that listed Martin and Judy as new residents, with my name and phone number scribbled down as their emergency contact. I went to the facility the next day, showed the staff the letter, and asked to be removed from every form, every file, and every future call list. The coordinator gave me a polite nod, typed something into her computer, and told me they seemed like a lovely couple. I didn't correct her, just thanked her and left, feeling lighter with every step away from that building. I thought that would be the last of it, that they'd finally learn to stop reaching, until one evening I attended a small dinner for a colleague's retirement and found myself seated next to a woman who used to work in education. We exchanged small talk, and at one point she repeated my last name and asked if I was Martin and Judy's kid, said she had been in the same dorm as Judy back in college. I smiled, lifted my glass, and told her I wasn't anymore, because that felt closer to the truth than anything else I could have said. That night, I went home, opened the fireproof safe I had carried with me from apartment to apartment, and took out every letter, every card, and every note they had ever sent me. I fed them one by one through the shredder until the box was empty, the sound of the machine loud and steady in the quiet of my living room. When I finished, I opened every window in my apartment and let the cold air in, breathing it like a promise I'd made to myself and finally kept. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived from a cousin I barely remembered. Someone getting married in a small town I hadn't visited in over a decade. The message was short, polite, and left a blank space for a +1, with no mention of family roles or speeches or expectations. I went, not for Martin or Judy or any sense of duty, but because it felt like a clean slate. I stayed on the edge of the crowd, spoke only when spoken to, and left before the dancing started, slipping away without fanfare or goodbyes. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel room, packed my bag, and checked out without looking back, The drive home quiet except for the hum of the tires on the highway. I knew, as the miles passed, that whatever connection they had tried to force back into place had finally snapped for good, and I wasn't sad or angry or relieved, just free in a way I hadn't been before. And this time, I wasn't waiting for the silence to break again.